Hi, I'm here today with Dr. Josh Lauer from the University of New Hampshire and the author of Creditworthy, A History of Consumer Surveillance and Financial Identity in America. And we're going to talk a little bit about credit scores in the United States. So Josh, thank you so much for joining us. To start us
Happy.
off, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and why you got into credit scores in the first place?
Yeah, so my PhD is in communication, and when I was a graduate student, I was studying media history at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was interested in the way that people think about money and financial identity and their value as economic subjects. And one of the problems I was interested in is how people talk about how much money they make or don't talk about it. And what I discovered is that it's a topic that people don't talk about. So there's a taboo around speaking of personal income. And I was interested in trying to find places where people did talk about income. And it occurred to me that credit bureaus might be a place where there was information about how personal income and salaries were recorded. And when I started to look into the development of credit bureaus, I realized that there wasn't very much information about it at all. And then I started a graduate project studying the history of credit bureaus in the United States and credit reporting. And one thing led to another, and I eventually wrote a history about this particular topic. But it's also connected to my broader interests in information infrastructures and the history of how information is processed. And the kinds of information I was interested in were, initially written records, bureaucratic records. And it turns out that there's a long history of efforts by organizations, including governments, but also businesses, to collect information about individuals and to collect information about their salaries, their income, their property, and even information about their personal character and their local reputations. And this is sort of the broader context of my interest in information and record keeping.
Cool. So do you mind providing a brief history on how credit scores came to be used in the US?
Sure. So credit scoring really doesn't emerge in the United States until the late 1950s. But there have long been efforts to try to make credit risk or creditworthiness into some kind of number or metric. And this dates back to the 1850s, believe it or not. There were credit reporting organizations that were compiling reports, written reports about business people who were looking for credit, either goods to sell in their stores or materials, raw materials to use to make into products. And the first credit reporting organizations were designed to collect information about business owners. So in the 1850s, some of these firms, which are today Dun and Bradstreet, which are major firms in business credit reporting, started to publish credit rating books. And they were summaries in alphanumerical code indicating the creditworthiness of different individuals who owned businesses. And some of these volumes were very large. They may contain 50 to 80,000 names in a volume. They look a lot like an old telephone book in some ways. And so these were quantitative looking metrics, but they were really just hierarchical. So, the person at the top with the best credit reputation was A1 or A1 plus, and somebody who had a poor credit reputation might be a C, or there might be an asterisk, which meant that you had to come and ask at the credit office what the information was about, because they were afraid of publishing something that would be libelous or so damning that they would be sued in court. So these are early efforts to rate an individual's credit reputation. They're not mathematical or statistically based. It's trying to convert information in narrative credit reports into some sort of symbol or alphanumeric metric. But during the 1940s, there was a statistician who was interested in experimenting with whether or not credit risk could be turned into a statistical measure, and that you could actually develop something quantitative to estimate the risk of credit default. And this system was developed in 1940. World War II happened, and this is also before commercial computers were available. So the calculations were so complicated that they couldn't well, they could do that by hand, but it would take so long that the value of the results would not be worth the effort. So in the late 1950s, you have the beginning of statistical credit scoring with computers, and the sort of leading figures are William Fair and Earl Isaac, who become Fair Isaac, a company they form. And they use early commercial computers to begin to tabulate a measure for creditworthiness. And really what a credit score is it's simply a ranking system trying to rank order the likelihood that a given person will default on a loan. So, the scale is contingent on how it's developed. It just so happens that the FICO score, which becomes the major credit score, is based on a scale with the high score of 850 and a low score much lower than the hundreds and the 500s. But credit scoring is this way of using statistics to collect lots of information about borrowers who are very similar, that are a sample that can be compared and is large enough to draw statistical inferences from. And this is the beginning of the credit score in the 1950s. And it doesn't really get very, very popular until the 1990s. There are credit scoring systems that are sold by Fair Isaac throughout the 70s and 1980s. But it's really after Fair Isaac introduces what's called a generic or credit bureau credit score in the late 1980s. And this is what is actually the FICO credit score that we're familiar with now. And the big difference between FICO credit scores and earlier credit scores is that the information that's used to calculate them comes from credit bureaus. So before the late 1980s, each credit scoring system had to be devised for each different customer. So if you had a bank in New York City, you had to have analysts come in and look at your particular customer sample and then develop a model and score your particular customers. But a bank in New York couldn't use the same credit scoring system that a department store in Philadelphia could. They had different kinds of customers, so there wouldn't be statistical validity to compare these two samples. So the big difference with credit bureau scores is that by the late 1980s, credit bureaus are collecting so much information about a national population that they can develop models that are generalizable, that a bank in New York City can use to score potential customers, just like a department store in Philadelphia can, or a bank in San Francisco and a department store in Los Angeles. And so the FICO score, based on credit bureau data, rather than the store or the bank's own customers, becomes the basis of the modern credit score.
Wow, that's really interesting. And also more recent than I was expecting, given how widespread it is today.
Yeah, it's, I mean, like I said, the idea of statistical scoring with computers exists, throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And there are banks and department stores that are buying models and developing them for their own customers. But it really becomes a major way to start scoring later. And so I mentioned that the FICO score, that sort of generalized generic credit bureau model, is developed in the late 1980s. But the turning point in terms of its use comes in 1995. And that's the year that government-backed mortgage companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, tell their banks, the underwriters that are working with them, that they have to submit credit scores with each of their mortgage applications. And then from that moment, the FICO score essentially becomes a requirement of a mortgage application, because those lenders were processing so many loans in the United States. So at the same time, during the 1990s and part of the 1980s, you also have different kinds of credit models that are being developed. So in addition to the generic FICO score, you have specialized scores for auto loans, specialized scores for home loans, specialized scores for credit cards, specialized scores for utility accounts. So when we talk about a credit score, it's not just one score, and I think many of us are led to believe that we have a credit score. It's one score. It's this number between 500 and 850, and that's the number. But in reality, there are hundreds of credit models, thousands of them, and each of us has more than one score, and we're scored in different ways using different models for different kinds of credit accounts and relationships.
How do these different specialized scores translate into the use of credit scores outside of lending, such as in insurance?
So you mentioned the use of credit scores for auto insurance, and this is a controversial use of credit scores because you might ask, what does being likely to not default on a loan have to do with whether or not you're going to make a claim for an accident? And there is no relationship that anyone is willing to say directly. But I mean, I think this gets to some of the issues of morality that are linked to credit as well. And this idea that if you have a low credit score, that somehow you're a morally suspect person, that you're irresponsible, that you're dishonest in some way. So one of the reasons that the use of a credit score for auto insurance is controversial is because there's obviously not an easily articulated, or at least explicitly articulated relationship. But these credit scores are said to be highly predictive, that if you can use that kind of information, you can actually predict whether or not a person is likely to file a claim. It's a difficult thing to address because there's a lot of controversy around the use of algorithms in everyday life. The credit score is the most obvious one. Consumer credit score is probably the oldest consumer algorithm that's been in use. But the fear is always, what are the algorithms going to be used for? What kinds of data is used to make predictions? And is that data related to things that could be discriminatory in ways that are unfair to individuals?
Well, besides the example of auto insurance, are there other examples where being represented by this data can lead to discrimination or other issues?
So like I said, there's a lot of discussion about algorithmic discrimination, or at least algorithmic inequity. And a lot of it is not intentional. It's not as though anyone developing a credit score certainly is looking for ways to discriminate against any protected group of people. But because the variables that are used can be associated with things that become proxies for other personal characteristics, this is a problem. So in the context of credit scoring, for example, it turns out that using a variable like a zip code, for example, or length of employment can be discriminatory unintentionally. Zip code because of the way that racial segregation works in housing. A zip code could represent a predominantly minority neighborhood. And length of employment for women who have children and sometimes leave the workforce for a period of time and then could be discriminated against unintentionally using that characteristic. But if you expand that and think about all the ways that algorithms are used in everyday life, with search engines, with job applications, with health triaging, with protective children's services, all of these different kinds of things that are addressed by Cathy O'Neill in Weapons of Math Destruction point to how a variable that is seemingly innocuous, or one that's not intended to be discriminatory, can have the effect of making some people score in ways that they look like they're criminal, they look like they're dangerous, they look like they're at risk, they look like they're a bad employee, for example. And so one of the big challenges with scoring broadly, not just credit scoring, is to make sure that the variables that are being used do not interact in ways or become proxies for things that are unfair to specific populations.
Is there any way to mitigate this for people, or like maybe policy solutions that we can try to implement? So
the example of credit scoring is really helpful because it is what I would call the oldest consumer algorithm that's been widely used, and it's heavily regulated. It's been heavily regulated since the 1970s. And there are teams of regulators that work in banks and work with financial institutions to oversee their scoring programs to make sure that they're fair and equitable. But this is just one sector. And so while credit scoring, may be more or less fair, and the models are not overtly discriminatory, all of these other algorithms that are used in everyday life are not. And this is one of the things that that I think we're grappling with as a society now, because I don't know if there's enough regulatory human power to go out and to examine every single algorithm that's out there to make sure that it's not discriminating against particular populations. And to make it even more complicated, I'm not a computer scientist or mathematician, but what I've read is that some of these algorithms and the machine learning programs are so complicated that software engineers really don't understand how variables are interacting or how inference is being made, what the correlations are. And that's troubling because one of the things that I think as a society we would like to do is to try to minimize any kinds of inequity or discriminatory harms that might be happening based on some sort of automated system.
Yeah, it's also tough because oftentimes it's not necessarily the algorithm that's discriminatory, it's the input data that is. And
So
yeah, sorry.
No, you're exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that this is reflected in credit scoring is just the median score for different racial groups in the United States. On average, African Americans and Hispanic people have a lower credit score than white Americans and also Asian Americans. And it's, in a perfect world where there was no historical or systemic discrimination, you would believe that any racial category would have very similar median score, and that's not the case. And so it's not that the scores, the data that's being used is discriminating against individuals based on race. But if you look at the historical conditions and the way that generational wealth has been accumulated or not accumulated, the way education has developed over hundreds of years, there are disparities, and the data reflects the inequality in society. It's not, like you said, it's not that the algorithm is not objective or being used improperly. It's just that the data, if there's discrimination in the data, if society has some inequity and discrimination, it's reflected in the models as well.
Cool. So finish up, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you feel should be mentioned? Or anything that you wanted to talk about that hasn't been mentioned?
So, you asked about regulation, and I think that really is the big problem that we're facing going forward, because, I think credit scoring is a wonderful tool. I mean, one of the ways that credit is democratized and that we get access to credit quickly is because it's automated. In the past, each credit decision had to be made by a human being, sitting down with another person, taking their application, looking them in the eyes and trying to decide whether they're trustworthy or not. So the technology has the potential to be very democratizing. And one of the things that I believe we have to be careful about is not to put so much faith in the technology itself, even though it can do marvelous things, because as you mentioned, the data itself that's being used, the input is the trouble. And I think there's a lot of momentum to use algorithms to solve a lot of problems in society. And I think that one of the things that we want to be very mindful of, and I believe that you're working on in your project as well, is to think about the ways that algorithms can have unintended effects, unintended negative effects for certain populations, and to think about ways that policies and new products, especially around lending and credit risk, are developed so that they are developed in a way that that mitigates as much of that harm as possible.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful to have you.
Happy to talk to you.